Welcome, everybody. I'm Judy with Hope Dementia Ministry. Our topic for tonight is coming to terms with the diagnosis of dementia. It concentrates on the early stage. Most of the things that I talk about, most of our topics deal with middle stage dementia when people need much more caregiving. But this is going to really take a look at the beginning, how it starts, when it starts, and how things can progress, what kinds of decisions you need to make in the beginning, what you should be thinking about as far as a plan goes for the future, because this is a long journey and the future is going to go better if there's the more planning that goes into it. So when we talk about early stage can actually start decades before someone is ever diagnosed. I have many friends all in their 50s, and they're talking about brain fog and short-term memory loss and these kinds of things. And to me, as a dementia person, that is a red flag to me. There are issues that they're having in their 50s that could well develop into something more serious later on. So early stages aren't always recognized. Sometimes when we have spouses who live together, the spouse will notice something is different, but we all know things change as we age. And so a lot of times we let it go. We don't think it's anything of circumstance. We think, well, that's normal aging. People forget words, people forget things, people start driving less well. So we kind of let things go by the wayside. But many of those things are not just part of normal aging. They are an indication of something more serious that could lead to something beyond that is much more serious. Oftentimes we call that mild cognitive impairment. So if someone goes to the doctor and the doctor does a simple screening that asks for their orientation and what's the day, the month, the season of the year, do they know where they are, what kind of building are they in, just this baseline. And if the person, we start with a baseline, if they haven't had that kind of interview before, the doctor might say, okay, things seem all right, we have a baseline, but then the doctor might also say, well, there's some little concerning things. Not dementia, it's not to that point yet, but we might classify it as mild cognitive impairment. That means, you're struggling with some things, you're a little bit less focused. Maybe you drop some words, there's a certain common word you can't come up with, something like that, that is not just standard behavior for someone of a set age. But when we hear something like that, we have to understand that there could be more to come. It might not develop into more, but it could very well develop into more. So when we hear something like that, we want to think, all right, what am I doing? What can I do? If I did develop dementia later on, what kinds of things do I want to organize now? What do I want to have taken care of? But too many people don't have that mindset. Too many people say, that scares me. I don't want to talk about that. I'm fine. I'm perfectly fine. That doctor doesn't know what he's talking about. And people get right into denial. Rather than being proactive and trying to get out ahead of it, they say, no, nothing's really happening. That's not going on. But because decline happens slowly over a long period of time, there's a long early stage. And so people can compensate. If someone's a little confused about something or they're forgetting appointments or something, they can be more careful about writing things down. They can avoid telling someone else that something's going on. If someone lives alone, this early stage often goes unnoticed by anyone because the brain is an amazing organ. And it can compensate and it can fill in spaces where there are deficits, and the person can really function quite normally. So I want to go over some of the characteristics of the early stage. There are often memory issues because Alzheimer's type dementia is the most common of the dementias. 50 to maybe even 80% of people diagnosed with dementia have the Alzheimer's type, which starts with memory loss issues. And so in the early stage, there might be things like, I can't remember appointments, or I can't remember birthdays like I used to be able to, but I just put them on a calendar. And then when that date comes up, I send a card or whatever. So we can compensate for that. We can manage that. We can work around it. Sometimes there are things like driving impairments. Yes, everyone slows down as they age, but sometimes as people develop dementia, it's not just a slowing of reactions, that's part of it, but sometimes it can be confusion about, what does that sign mean? I see the sign, but I can't quite figure out, it means to merge over, or it means to, the center lane is not a turn lane, or, whatever, so that driving can become more hazardous for the person. Even though they're very capable, they can get themselves around, they can operate the vehicle. Sometimes the navigation part of driving can be slipping. Driving is a very complicated process. You have to know how to work the vehicle, first of all. You have to be able to maybe pull out of a garage or back out of a garage and into a street. And sometimes we see people having a hard time parking. Maybe their depth perception is starting to be affected. Maybe they have close calls. Maybe their mirror swipes the mirror on another car because they drove a little bit too close to it. Maybe they're getting traffic tickets because they're breaking some minor little traffic rules that they're getting caught at. Or when there are changes, people start to compensate by only going the same way all the time. They take the same route to church and back, the same route to the grocery store and back, the same route to their child's house and back. But what if a traffic light is installed at an intersection where there used to be a stop sign? That could really throw somebody off. Or if, heaven forbid, they build a roundabout at an intersection instead of a traffic light, that can be very confusing and it can really throw somebody off. They can cause an accident. They can completely not understand how to use that. And as dementia progresses more and more, it's very hard for people to learn how to do those new kinds of things. So that's where driving can come into question. And following directions. If I have to drive this way and then turn right and then turn left, to remember that series of questions, people can start to get lost in familiar areas. So this all happens in the early stage when, for the most part, we're not even aware of it. Often adult children aren't aware of the compensation that their parents are doing while they're driving for a long time, sometimes for many years. And so they don't have a good picture of what's happening. Trouble with logic and understanding. Sometimes things just don't make sense, or we can't figure out a problem. If there's something that needs to be fixed in the house, or there's something that we used to be able to do and now we can't figure out how to do it, that comes on more gradually. And sometimes people will just say, oh, I can't figure it out, or it's too complicated. And that's a little bit scary, especially if you could do that. And sometimes people in this early stage, they're still working. They still have their careers. And maybe there is a part of their job that becomes confusing for them. Maybe there is some mathematics involved in their job and they can't make those calculations anymore. They seem perfectly normal, but there are these logical aspects or these problem-solving aspects that they're having trouble with. And so, different people will have different symptoms and they will impact them differently. Complicated household tasks. There are a lot of people who end up being hoarders as they progress with their dementia. They may not logically understand, okay, this more is coming in, this stuff has to go out. They start to focus more intently on, well, I need these things. I have to have these things. I might refer to these things. And so for security reasons, people tend to collect and collect and collect and not get rid of. So they're not going through the typical house cleaning, house maintenance things that they used to be doing because the tasks might be a little too difficult for them to figure out. They're not saying that to anyone. And so often we look at older people who are not keeping up with things as well. They're slowing down. They're aging, they're getting tired. And so we compensate for them by giving excuses for why they're not keeping up with something. Sometimes we look at people who have difficulty with language and processing communication. People can continue to be able to talk and converse, but maybe they can't express exactly what they want to express in the terms that they would normally use to express that. Some people lose really common words. If you watched the movie Alive Inside, there's a woman, her name is Mary Lou, and she can talk and she can tell how the music makes her feel so good and feel like herself, but the doctor is holding up a spoon and she can't name what that object is. So it becomes harder and harder for people to express how they're feeling, or maybe even to express what their fears are, what they're experiencing, that it's hard for them to come up with the right words to tell somebody what they're going through. Confusion with time and place. Now, if you're like everyone else in the world, sometimes you get a little confused about what day it is. If you're retired, if you're laid off, if you're at home every day because of the pandemic, one day sort of blends into another. If you don't have a set work schedule that you know what day it is, or sometimes you do something, you'll say, wow, it feels like a Sunday, because of the thing that we just did. And actually, it's Tuesday. But if someone is really confused about what day it is and they do something that they think they should be doing on that day, for example, I used to work at a church and a lady came and she sat in the parking lot. She could drive herself to church and home. She sang in the choir, but she sat in the parking lot. Nobody else in the parking lot except the staff cars. She knocked on the door to try to get into the church and the church was locked. And then she came to the office and she said, well, when are the doors going to open to the church? And, we're like, well, the doors aren't open to the church today. You can access through the office building. And she was very confused. She thought it was Sunday. She was there, but it was the middle of the week. And that started happening more and more for her. Now, she lived alone. So we don't know what other kinds of, early signs were being displayed, or what other kinds of things were going on because she lived alone. It wasn't until she presented herself somewhere where she shouldn't be at that time and day, thinking that it was that other time and day. And there's other more serious symptoms like that, where people might actually become confused about where they are. I mean, she knew she was at the church. She just had the wrong day that she thought she was supposed to be there. More of a middle stage example would be when someone is in a familiar area and they are confused about where they are. So that's a little bit of a distinction between those two. Early symptoms also are people withdrawing from common social activities. They feel a little out of place. They feel a little out of who they are. And so it feels uncomfortable for them to put themselves out there with other people. So sometimes people will step away from their social activities. And then that's another reason that this early stage goes on a long time undetected. If their friends and family aren't seeing them as regularly, aren't interacting with them as regularly, they maybe don't see some of these early things. But people will often withdraw and kind of self-isolate out of fear and insecurity about going out into the world. And then there are sometimes personality changes. There is a man who was a speaker about dementia. He had Alzheimer's, and he had been a teacher and a lecturer. And once he developed Alzheimer's and was diagnosed, he said, okay, I'm going back out on the speaking circuit. I want people to know what it feels like to have Alzheimer's. I want them to know what it's like from my perspective. And he told the story about his daughter lived out of state, and she came to visit. This was before the diagnosis. And she came to visit, and he hugged her, and they had the car ride home, and she spent several days there with her family. And then when it was time for her to go back home, she pulled her mother aside and she said, "What's wrong with Dad?" And her mother said, "Well, what are you talking about? What do you mean?" And she said, "When I got here, he didn't hug me like he used to hug me. He didn't hug me really tight like he used to. And he's swearing." And he had never been a person who would swear. Now, the daughter noticed this because she hadn't seen her dad in a long time. The mother said, "You're right, he is swearing." She hadn't even really put those things together, that there was a personality change. That is caused by a breakdown of the executive functioning part of the brain, the part that tells us what is and is not appropriate to say. And a very early symptom often is a person feeling more free to swear. Um, they're still acting extremely normal, like they can take care of themselves and like nothing is wrong, but that's a symptom that comes out sometimes with people. Other times, personality changes are caused by this unusual feeling that the person who is experiencing early symptoms is having. They're maybe, they know that they're lacking. They know that they're having more trouble than they used to. And so they become concerned. And whenever we become concerned about something, we're not our normal selves. We don't present as our normal selves. And so other people can interpret that as a personality change. Maybe we're not as outgoing. We don't do the social things. I wonder what's up with so-and-so because they're not whatever. And sometimes when we live with the person, it happens so gradually, we don't notice it strikingly. Often it is people from the outside who haven't seen you for a while that notice something is different. But when we start looking at accepting the diagnosis, and it's usually the spouse that knows first that something's happening. Often even before the person with dementia is realizing that these symptoms are something, because the spouse is there every day, lives with it. The spouse is often the one who urges the person to see a doctor. We should get this checked out. I'm noticing these things. I'm hearing this. But in some cases, the spouse is in denial. And in some cases, the spouse actually hides away the loved one that's having issues because they don't want anyone else to know. They want to take care of this person all by themselves. They're afraid of what the perception of others might be. And so, this is kind of a disservice to the person because by keeping them isolated, brings on depression, and depression escalates dementia. And, those are not things that we want to have going on. But then sometimes we look at the adult children. So the spouse has accepted that spouse knows something's wrong. Well, before we move on to adult children, let's talk about the person receiving the diagnosis. There's often very different reactions there as well. Sometimes, in fewer cases, the person knows something's wrong, they get the diagnosis, they are more accepting of it because they do know something's wrong. But this tends to be a person who is more proactive about taking care of things on a regular basis. They might be saying, well, I do know something's wrong. I want to find out what it is. I want to go to the doctor. I want to figure out what's happening because maybe there's something that they can do. Where other people will say, no, there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with me. I'm not going to the doctor. So those are the two very different responses we might get from the person who would be receiving the diagnosis. And then when we look at the children, so oftentimes, and I've met so many couples that are both on both sides of this. So the one couple, the man had been diagnosed with dementia. His wife was very supportive, but she thought it was time to tell the kids. But he didn't want to tell the kids. And he was afraid of what their reaction might be. People who receive a diagnosis of dementia don't want to be a burden. They don't want to be a burden to their family, but they also don't want to be abandoned. And that's where you get the two different reactions. If someone doesn't want to be a burden, maybe they don't want to tell. They don't want people to know. They don't want people to abandon them and walk away or feel, oh no, I have to take care of this person now. So when we come to the kids, a lot of times kids will immediately go into denial. Oh no, this can't be, this can't be. And part of that is because they look at it from their perspective of, oh, well, I know grandma had this, and now if dad has it, oh man, that means I'm next, which is not true. We get this feeling that the epidemic of dementia that we see is inherited, and it's not. There is a type of early Alzheimer's that is genetically identified, so it is an inherited thing, but that's a very small percentage of people. The vast majority of people that we see is not something that's inherited. However, we do share genetic makeup with our families. So if grandma had it and now dad has it, we have to look at lifestyle and we have to look at what things may have contributed to it. And so to do that, you have to learn about it. You have to find out what's going on and what might be causing it. Are we foodies? Are we couch potatoes? Do we like our alcohol? Do we smoke? And am I following the same pattern that my generations before me have followed? And if that is the case, then yes, you are much more likely to follow in the same footsteps. However, when we look at the underlying causes for a lot of dementia, and it really focuses on diabetes, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, high cholesterol, vascular issues, all those kinds of things. We know those things are preventable and in many cases reversible. So if you are an adult child and your parent is developing early stages of dementia and you are seeing that, that's a wake-up call to you. There might even be interventions that can be made for the person in early stages, that they can get more exercise, they can eat more healthy, and they can slow down the process. But if you are the next generation down, you need to take this seriously. You need to think, what am I doing in my life that I will set myself up for not exhibiting my genes in this same way? Some adult children have a lot of fear about what's going to happen in the caregiving realm. Who is it going to fall onto? Is it going to be the oldest? Is it going to be the only girl? Is it going to be the person who lives the closest? Who's going to be responsible for that? And also when we look at the makeup of the family. We often see the older child who has maybe been given more responsibility in the family tends to step up and take on more responsibility. If there's a baby at the tail end of a large family, they have often been sheltered from taking on responsibility. Nobody's expected too much of them throughout their life. And so maybe in this circumstance, then, they don't feel equipped to step up and do something major like this. So there's a lot of dynamics going on in families when someone is first being diagnosed and we know something's going on. Sometimes spouses and adult children will really push the person developing dementia to try harder. Dad, come on, you can do this. Try harder. Here, do this crossword puzzle book. Do these word searches. Do these brain exercises. Don't let this happen. Come on, you know me. Come on. Oh, no. The sky isn't blue. The sky is gray. And arguing with them all the time and challenging them all the time. And that can be really damaging for family dynamics. That can be very damaging for the person developing dementia because they feel insecure, they feel combative all the time, and so you're just setting the whole situation up for turmoil down the road. And that's more what our other general sessions focus in on. But now we're sort of doing the prequel. We're sort of looking at how we get into that. And so everyone sort of comes into this differently. There are those in the family who will want to be proactive, and that might include the person getting the diagnosis, saying, I want to learn as much as I can. I want to know as much about this as I can. I want to be as responsible as possible. I want to have some say in what happens to me the rest of my life. So that's a proactive person. And there might be children or a spouse that says the same thing. Okay, let's get some classes, let's get some education, let's find out how to deal with this before things start happening. And then there's other people in the family that are like, well, I'm not so sure that this diagnosis is real. I'm not so sure that that's what's really going on. I think he's fine. He's fine. But then maybe as things progress, they might come on board a little bit later. And then you get down to the bottom where you have someone who is steeped in denial. And that person really honestly may never come on board. They may never take any part of the responsibility. They may be critical of your caregiving plan or the caregiving that you're doing. They may want to direct things from afar. And sometimes, it's almost a waste of time to worry about trying to get that eternal denier on board. It's better to work with those who are reluctant to come on board and those that have been on board from the beginning. That makes life a lot easier and a lot less stressful for many families. We all work through a multitude of feelings when there's a diagnosis like this that comes up. Most often it's denial. We just can't believe it. We just can't believe it. Where did this come from? Especially if it wasn't in the family, especially if there is no history of it. When there's a history of it, we're like, oh yeah, I was suspecting, or, I was waiting for it. But if there's no history of it, it really blindsides people and they don't want to accept it. They don't want to admit that this is a possibility. And so they really, really struggle with denial. Other people even become angry through this process. Maybe they are resentful of a family member who isn't coming on board, who isn't helping out or pulling their weight. Or maybe they're even resentful of the parent or the person who is exhibiting these symptoms. Maybe it's a spouse feeling angry that their spouse won't admit that something's going on, won't go to see a doctor. There's a lot of reasons where anger can crop up. And it can really stew unless we deal with it. And um, it's about finding ways to work through it, finding someone to talk to, learning about what's happening so you can understand what's happening rather than just being in denial or being angry. There's a lot of grief involved. We grieve when we lose something. Change is difficult, especially change that is thrust upon you, that you are not looking forward to, that you did not expect. And sometimes it takes a long time to work through all these feelings that come up when we are asked to change. And losing something, when we are perceiving that we are losing something, that causes grief for people. And you have to allow yourself to grieve. There is a process that we go through, admitting that, this is something that I'm losing. And I feel bad about this something that I'm losing. People sometimes grieve ahead of time. Like if they feel they're going to lose this relationship with their loved one that they used to have, they know that's going to change. Rather than being in the moment and enjoying that relationship while they still have it and changing with it, they get into the cycle of, oh no, I'm not going to have my mother, I'm not going to have my father, or my spouse is not going to be the same, we're not going to have the same relationship. And they grieve even before the relationship has changed. But we do have to allow ourselves to grieve. And once we allow ourselves to do that for a while, then we have to move on to looking at what's positive still, what's still there, what is still there with our relationship, what's good with the relationship, what can the person still do? And that's a lot of what we look at in our other sessions as well. But sadness is always involved. And if we're not careful, that sadness, we can go away and we can sulk in the sadness. That can lead to depression. And depression can lead to increased dementia. So we have to be careful about not letting ourselves sink into the sadness. Once we reach acceptance, okay, this is happening, where do we go from here? That's a point that we want to try to reach, because that's a healthy jumping off point for what do we do next? How do we be proactive to set things up? And one of the first things that I want to recommend that everyone do, if you don't already have your legal things in place, you really need to do that. And I'm preaching to myself as well. I've been taking some classes on, the elder law, legal aspects of all of this. And what it's saying to me is, girl, get yourself in there and get, some of these things taken care of. So when we talk about legal, we're talking about powers of attorney, whether it's medical power of attorney or financial power of attorney. And if you don't have that set up ahead of time, you can be in big trouble. And I'll give you an example. I had a house in Southgate. I sold my house. I moved to Canton. But when I was selling the house, the first people that made an offer wanted to buy it because the mother lived across the street from me, and she had dementia. The grandson, the adult grandson, was living with her and caring for her. Now, the daughter and the son-in-law and the young daughter wanted to buy my house, so if something happened, they were right there. They were not on top of her. She still had her house, but they were right there. And I thought, that's wonderful. I work in the dementia field. I think that's really great and supportive. And so the day before the closing, so we had the closing set up back to back. The day before the closing for the house, the people took mom to the bank, and it turns out they were using her money to purchase the house. So they got to the bank to have her remove that money from her bank account, and she was not having a good day. She was confused. She didn't know what was happening. And they kept saying to her, we talked about this. Remember, we're going to buy the house across the street. This money is for the house across the street. And this is what we talked about. And she's like, no, no, no. She didn't want to do it. Well, what happened was the bank personnel looked at this as this woman is under duress. She is being pushed into doing something that she doesn't want to do. And so the whole thing fell apart. They froze her assets. They could not get the money. We met at the closing just to discuss what was going to happen. And, it was a whole big mess. The next day, I had the closing on my condo set. We were able to move that off a week, and they were going to see a lawyer, and they were going to see what they could get taken care of. But the fact that she already had dementia in a more advanced form, they were not able to do anything quickly at all. They had to go to court. They had to prove a lot of things, that they were not taking advantage of her. And it was a terrible mess. The whole thing fell apart because they were not proactive about getting some of these kinds of things in place. So if you don't have this in place yet, please, 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 please contact your elder law attorney and make sure that you get this taken care of. The other thing that you need to do legally is think about finances for the future. If someone who has dementia, can still make decisions and can still be part of the planning for the future, what is long-term care going to look like? Is it going to be at home, family only doing it? Are you capable of doing that? What about when things get worse? Are you going to be looking at a long-term care facility? What's going to pay for that? Is it going to take all of the life savings that's going to pay for that? There are ways that they can legally protect the assets of the well spouse and still provide for taking good care of the person living with dementia. So that's an important thing to look at. Are you covered? Are you going to be able to make that work? And so then that whole aspect of future care. If I know something's going on and I am in the early stages, I want to have some say about what the rest of my life is going to be like. Do I want to look at some care homes? Do I want to look at some options and say, okay, if my family can no longer take care of me, I would like to live in this small community where there's only 6 people and it's a house and there's a backyard. Or maybe I would like to live in this place that's bigger and have my little apartment here and have a nice courtyard but have some say in that. Or I want to live in my own home as long as possible. There's plenty of money. We can do this. This is what I want. To be able to say that for yourself is really important. So that's one of the biggest benefits of early diagnosis. And another part of that is being able to become an advocate. Okay, so if this is happening to me, how can I turn this into something that could help other people? Can I be an advocate like that man that I was telling you about who was a professor, and when he developed Alzheimer's, he said, I want to go out and I want to talk to people about this. I want other people, I want doctors and family members and educators to know what it's like to be me, to be the person with Alzheimer's. I want to do that as long as I can. And he did it for a long time. He has passed away now, but he died from cancer. He didn't die from the Alzheimer's. And he was able to really put some things out there for people. I've met other couples who have been out to try to educate people. In my certification classes at Schoolcraft College, they brought in couples where one person was living with dementia and the other spouse was the caregiver. And the person living with dementia told about what it's like, what it feels like, what it is to be in this different realm, how it is to experience a wonderful family party and then the next day it slips away from them and they can't really remember what that was like. And it was very powerful for us to hear that from them. And when I was out in Macomb County doing some sessions a couple years back, there was a lady that came to the sessions and she felt like she really wanted to share with this big group that was there what it was like for her living with dementia. And she had always been very active and very self-sufficient and very independent. And it hit her one day. Her husband went out golfing and she was home alone and she was afraid. She was afraid to be home alone. And that was the first time she really decided, okay, something's wrong. This is not the usual me. And so then they started seeing a doctor and they started looking at other things and they did lots of testing and she was diagnosed with having Alzheimer's. But it was something that she wanted to share with people so that it could help them in some way. So the sooner you're diagnosed, the sooner you can get into something like that or clinical trials. Once people are beyond a certain level in their battle with dementia, they don't necessarily qualify for clinical trials. It's people who are in earlier stages because the medications don't really do much for someone who's later on, but they have noticed some improvements in people who are in the earlier stages. So the earlier you can detect this and the earlier you can be proactive about doing something about it, there's lots of things that open up to you. So many people are afraid that, and historically, neurologists have not been good at delivering these kind of diagnoses. They say, well, you have you have dementia of the probable Alzheimer's type. So I would suggest you go home and get your affairs in order. Okay. And so that's why people come to me, because they don't get anything about what is life going to be like, and they kind of get this feeling, get your affairs in order because, you only have a short amount of time, but you actually have a long time yet. And it's much better to be involved in life. The longer you can be involved in life, the better your life is going to be. Getting a support group or a counselor is a very important step. Someone you can talk to, someone you can confide in. And especially for the person with dementia, if they want to talk about it and not feel so alone, there are counselors out there who can deal with that. Other things to think about are developing your care team. Nobody can do this on their own. Many people have families, children who can help out. Some people don't. Some people are in this alone. If that's you, then you need to look in what resources are around your community that can help with this, meaning home care companies where you can hire people to come in and assist you, hire people to come in and do the things that are too difficult for you to do. You don't have the strength, you don't have the mobility to care for someone who is an adult person. But there's also daycare services, places that you can drop off your loved one if you have things that you need to do. If you are still working and you have a parent that needs care during the day, and you can drop them off at a day center because they're very mobile and active and they want to be around people and they want to be social, that's an excellent idea. And so those are some things that you need to think about in receiving the diagnosis. This is a long process. You're just in the beginning of it. There could be some difficult things ahead, but they will be made easier the more education you get, the more you learn, the more proactive you try to be about finding out what's going on and taking care of yourself. So caregivers often focus everything on someone else. You need to know from the beginning that this is going to be difficult. This is going to be stressful. You need to work on yourself as a caregiver. Make sure that you have time for your own health needs. Make sure that you are eating well, that you are sleeping well, because in the long run, if something happens to you, who is going to help direct what goes on down the road? So it's really important for self-care along with planning for what's going on for the rest of your loved one's life. Um, you have to accept that future plans are going to change. You know, um, a lot of people think about their retirement. Oh, we were going to retire and we were going to travel, and that might be out the window. And, even look at what we've lived through this year. The pandemic has changed people's futures. This is not how I thought I was going to spend the last 8 months of my life. And I'm sure that is exactly the same thing for you. So rather though than sitting and stewing and being depressed about it, if we can be proactive about making some positive changes in your life, what can you do while you're stuck at home? You can learn to cook healthy. You can exercise. You can call people on the phone. You can talk to people that you haven't talked to in a long time. What would you do if you have extra time on your hands? We all kind of fantasize about that. Now that we do, we're depressed because we have all this extra time. So think about exercising and laughing and listening to music. These are things you can do together. These are things that are beneficial for you and your loved one living with dementia. And so living each day to the fullest, being the best that you can be each day, not focusing on the negative things, but what is positive, what is happening that's going on that can be positive, that you can look for the silver lining, whatever you have to do to try to find something. And if you have a terrible day, you have a terrible day and you can start over tomorrow. But be kind to yourself, be kind to your loved one. Um, listen to the rest of these topics. There's lots and lots of clues for how to progress as dementia gets more into the middle stages where it's much more hands-on. Learning all that you can is going to be beneficial to everyone all the way around. So I wish you well, take care, and thank you for joining tonight.